My name is Ken Randall, and along with my co-host, Dean Kellye Testy, we're delighted to welcome you to the February edition of Live with Kellye and Ken. Since August of last year, each month we pick a subject of interest to law deans and people in the legal community and ask deans and experts to come and spend some time with us, sharing their insights and expertise. Today's program is about the financial landscape of legal education. How do we demystify, clarify, move beyond the superficiality of thinking about the finances of legal education? How do we put the financing of legal education in a current context with diminished admissions pools over the last couple of years? Are there innovative ways to think about legal education and financing? How do we improve inclusivity while focusing on law school budgets? Is there advice that we can provide to law school deans? Is there advice that we can provide to students thinking about law school? Again, along with Kellye Testy, who's the president and CEO of LSAC, we're delighted to have 4 deans with us this afternoon. In alphabetical order, Dean Jerry Anderson of Drake, Dean Danielle Holley-Walker of Howard, Dean Kevin Johnson of UC Davis, Dean Lyrissa Lidsky of the University of Missouri. Deans, we're delighted to have you spend the next hour with us. To start our program, we're going to ask each of the deans a separate question. And Dean Johnson, I think that you're our most senior dean, and we're going to start with you. There's a general perception that legal education is, quote, expensive, that it's expensive for students thinking about it. When you think about tuition, does the tuition revenue that you receive cover the law school expenses? And then really a second part to that is compare how tuition covers expenses perhaps today with what it did, say, 10 years ago.
That's a very good question, Dean Randall. Our fees have gone up in recent years, in part because as a public institution in a state that has been reducing expenses on education, our state support has decreased. So we currently collect about 80% of our budget from student fees, and about 20% of our budget comes from the state. In 1998, it was about 80% of our budget coming from the state and 20% from fees. So what's happened over that time is our costs have gone up some, but really our financing has changed dramatically from a state-funded system to a tuition-driven system. And that's had big impacts on our applicant pool, on the diversity of the student body, and other things that we're paying very close attention to. But the economics for us changed dramatically, and we continue to work within that framework. We've gotten a little bit more support in recent years from the state and through our campus, but in some ways we have become more of a private law school as opposed to a public law school. I sometimes will joke with friends that we're kind of publicly inspired law school, kind of what Chipotle is to Mexican food. You get a little sense of it, but you're not fully publicly supported as in the past. I find it disheartening, the decrease in public support and state support for a public law school. But it's one of the realities that we're dealing with, and it's created a lot of challenges for us, frankly. It's pushed us in the development realm in a way that we'd never gone. In a good way, we're pursuing that, and particularly we're focusing on raising money for student scholarships to help students fund their education. And I find that's actually a very easy sell to alums who at one point in time paid a small amount of money, less than a couple $1,000s a year, to a time now when they pay closer to $50,000 a year.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Appreciate you sharing those thoughts with us and how it's changed and how the ratios have changed and the sources that today you have to access in a way that you didn't in the past. Dean Holley-Walker, I want to turn to you. One of the things that makes law schools different from other disciplines is that legal education only has one accrediting body, the American Bar Association. And so many of us have served on ABA teams and are big fans of the ABA and their commitment to quality. But if you could pick one or more standards that you think help to drive up costs, things where there might be a level of flexibility, what would those be if you were to, be king for a day, queen for a day, focusing on changes in the ABA standards?
I think one of the big ones that I've been focused on is really the current bar passage standard, and whether we're going to change the bar passage standard. I say that because I think the impact of that is that typically students do need beyond what we teach in law school. Traditionally, most of them take commercial bar courses, for example, that end up being quite a bit of cost. And I think the idea was for a long time that students would completely absorb that cost. And I think now we're building in all of these additional academic success and bar preparation measures to help make sure, both on attrition rates, but also in terms of bar passage, that we are able to meet all of the ABA requirements. And I actually don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that law schools should be accountable in terms of making sure that their students are able to, the students who they admit are able to graduate, and that they are able to pass the bar in a reasonable period of time. But those are costs that used to not be associated, some of them with law schools, especially the bar passage issues, where now we are doing more and more on that front than we did when I went to law school only 20 years ago. We're doing a lot more on that front than we ever have. And I think that is a huge issue. And I think obviously in some ways the ABA has become more flexible. So for example, with the externship model, with the experiential learning 6 credits that could have cost law schools quite a bit, I think there is also an increase in the flexibility, for example, for externships, et cetera. But that's another requirement that many of us have had to invest in heavily, our clinical programs, and also all of the other courses that meet the experiential requirement. So that's another place where it's kind of, I think anything that really encourages a one-size-fits-all mentality, where all law schools must look exactly alike, must offer similar curriculum, all of those things I think can drive up costs, especially when many of us have different missions from maybe what the ABA sees as the typical law school.
Yeah. So Danielle, let me follow up on that a little bit. So are some of those financial pressures coming from the ABA, or are they coming from the breadth of legal education and how deans and faculties have expanded legal education?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think, some of it is coming from student expectation, right? Which I think the students now are a much more sophisticated customer than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And partly that's because of the downturn in admissions. Now they can look at comparisons on scholarships. They look at comparisons on career placement numbers. I think we're more transparent as an industry than we've ever been in terms of what are both our inputs and our outputs. So a lot of that is due to more information in the marketplace and students becoming more sophisticated, which means all of the constituencies, alumni, faculty, and students are all looking for us to meet a lot of these benchmarks, which in the past, it would simply maybe be enough to say, here's where we're ranked in U.S. News and World Report, or here is what our tradition is. And I think now people are really questioning what are the things that you do in terms of bringing students in, and then what can they reasonably expect on the other side. And all of that is leading to increased costs for law schools. Some of these things are good things in terms of accountability, but it also means that all law schools have to be prepared to make these kinds of investments.
Great, good, thank you. Well, that provides a perfect segue. I was going to ask Dean Anderson about U.S. News rankings. We know that when law students are thinking about law school, one of the primary places they go is U.S. News and World Rank, right? Although, as the Dean just said, one of the things with the rankings is that they treat all law schools the same when law schools have different missions. So what type of impact have the rankings had on the way that law schools operate? How does U.S. News look at direct expenses and the expenditure piece of ranking law schools?
I think there are a number of really harmful things that have come from the U.S. News rankings, and all of us, I'm sure, could pick our own terrible things that have been a consequence of it. But the ones that—
And Dean Anderson, can you speak up just a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you.
The things that I would highlight, they cause us to, for one thing, distribute our scholarship dollars in ways that I think are harmful. So the latest statistics I saw were that only 25% of students now pay full tuition. But the top half of your class in terms of incoming indicators are getting almost all the scholarship dollars at a lot of our schools. And so that means that the bottom 25% are really subsidizing the top half of the class. And I think that's very harmful in terms of debt distribution for those students. You get the students with some of the least attractive job options often are the ones that have the highest amounts of debt. And I think a lot of that is driven by U.S. News. U.S. News also puts emphasis or scores you on the amount spent per student, financial expenditures per student, which I think, as Dean Holley-Walker indicated, you know, there are lots of different ways to deliver legal education in a very quality way, and spending more money doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a better outcome. And so I think that's a very harmful part of U.S. News as well.
Good. Jerry, if law students or prospective law students wanted to think about legal ed beyond the rankings, how would you help them to define the value proposition of different law schools that they're considering?
Well, I think I'd think very carefully about where you want to practice, what type of practice you want to enter into, and then really carefully look at the amount you're going to have to spend for that particular law school and do the math, right? Because if you're going to graduate with $200,000 in debt and you really want to work in a town where the average salaries for incoming lawyers are $65,000 a year, it doesn't add up. And you probably need to think very carefully about that. The public interest loan forgiveness program obviously is a wonderful thing for many of our students, and that can be obviously valuable and something that we all need to fight to keep and to improve. But for a lot of our students, that they don't qualify for that, and yet they're going to be working in a small firm or a smaller town and not expect to see those higher salaries for maybe 10 years. And so they really need to think about whether spending an extra $10,000 a year in tuition for a different school really makes sense for them.
Great.
And not just look at a number, you know, the ranking, but, you know, this school is ranked 10 points higher than this school. It doesn't really tell you. I mean, look at the graduates from that school. Where are they practicing? Look at the types of practice that they're entering into. And see whether that fits with your goals.
Great, good. Dean Lidsky, you've been very patient, although I've seen you nodding your head a lot, so maybe these things are resonating. But I want to ask you about innovation. Given some of the things that Dean Johnson and the other deans have spoken about and some of the trends that we see, accreditation-wise, the breadth of what legal education does, U.S. News, are there innovative ways for deans to be thinking about the financial landscape of legal education? And I think you're muted, Dean Lidsky. We need to unmute you.
Here at Missouri, we've had great success with something we call our thrifty budget plan. When we started the thrifty budget, the debt burden in 2012 was about $78,000 upon graduation, and we got it down this last May to $44,338. And we did that starting in 2014. We have an accredited financial counselor who put students on an opt-out budget so that they would borrow less money at the outset. And only about, in the first year, we had 84% in the program, so only 16% opted out. And over time, we've had about somewhere between 71 and 74% of the entire law school on the thrifty budget where they borrow less. And we counsel them about what it's like to pay back that debt over time. Sometimes when you're young, I know for me, it was almost like Monopoly money. And you don't really appreciate what it's going to be like paying that debt back over time. And so we show them that. They get a debt awareness letter every year. And we show them how small choices, like living with a roommate and taking public transportation, can really have a transformative difference, saving them at least $7,000 a year over the course of their law school career. And I'm proud to say National Jurist ranked us number 7 in the country on debt burden, not even based on this year's figures, based on last year's figures of 53,000 graduating debt burden.
Wonderful, thank you. Dean Lidsky, let me stick with the theme of innovation. Are there things that law schools can be doing beyond the JD curriculum as they think of innovating themselves?
Well, so one of the things I really want is for our students never to feel the least disadvantaged because they go to school in a college town rather than a big city. So we have a semester in practice program where their last semester they can go work in any city in the country and still get their credits and get their foot in the door and get great jobs. We have a great job placement rate. And so I hope that program is going to improve that rate even further. Another thing I think is important for innovation is having faculty working on cutting edge issues. We've got blockchain experts, we've got drone experts, and we're really pushing. I'm teaching together with Randy Diamond, the head of our library, a law and tech course. And in that course, we're going to bring in lawyers who are practicing differently. And it's to show students the realm of possibilities, but it's also to kind of inculcate them with the idea that they need to be lifelong learners and they need to be able to turn on a dime when law practice calls for that.
Great, thank you. Deans Johnson and Anderson, I know that each of your law schools have programs other than the JD program, whether it's a JM, an LLM, some online. How much of that are you projecting to be able to make up for other shortfalls, whether it's from the state budget or from a diminution in tuition revenue?
We have an LLM program, and it's primarily foreign lawyers and judges, and it increased in size from about 10 in 1998 to about 75 last year. When the applications for JD students went down, we had some excess capacity, and we increased the size of our LLM program. And we have an LLM program that basically mainstreams all of the LM students into our JD classes, and we view it as a benefit for the JD students as well as for the LM students. There are a couple of sort of LM exclusive courses, including orientation to USA law in institutions and things like that, but for the most part, the LM students are in the same class as the JD students, and they basically pay the same tuition, although it's only for a year, and that was a revenue booster for a time. Things are changing now in the LLM, the foreign LLM market. The current administration isn't particularly viewed as attractive to foreign students in a way that past administrations were. And we have a large number of Chinese LLM students, and we're projecting that may decline over time. We also have a fair number of Muslim students who are, I think, looking to England and Australia and other countries as opposed to the US at this time for a variety of reasons. So while the LM program for us helped significantly our revenue projections and our budget, for a good number of years, actually from about 2008 to 2017, the future of that is largely uncertain, and we're thinking about a number of other possibilities. Maybe it's online certificate programs, maybe it's other kinds of online programs. But I do think that this is a place where innovation is going to be very important, and we're going to try to stay on top of, if not at the forefront of. It does seem, I have to say, the financial situation now is, in my mind, much more stable than it was in 2009, 2010, when applications were dropping 30% a year. They're going up a little bit now. I think ours have gone up 5% the last couple of years, and they seem to be going up nationally. I tend to think that's a result of the employment market, and that may not continue, well, it's unlikely to continue forever, since we tend to see cycles of economic activity. So I think this is a good time to be thinking about programs that'll help us make the budget when times aren't so flush.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Jay, in terms of
two ideas. One would be, are there audiences other than JD students that you could be thinking about, non-lawyers? And then secondly, how about research funding opportunities? Typically, law schools have not really focused on research funding. Are those two untapped sources that your law school or others are thinking about?
Yes, so I think we're all thinking about diversifying our portfolios, so to speak, and looking for other sources of income, but I think in general, it's thinking about legal education more broadly, that it's not just about the JD, where society is always going to need a certain number of people that know everything from income tax to bail hearings, but it's not, there are also a lot of other people in regulated industries, for example, which is practically everything at this point, that need to know something about law, but don't need to be lawyers. And so we started, for example, a Master of Compliance, a Master of Jurisprudence in Compliance and Risk Management that combines some business school knowledge along with law knowledge. And so the master's programs give you a little opportunity to do something new, something that really responds to market demands. And we think that master's program now that we're taking online is a way to really fulfill what society is telling us we need, which is people that know something about law, but they don't need a 3-year program to be a JD for this particular type of work that they're being asked to do. So that's one way I think that law schools are responding to the changing needs of the marketplace. And I can't remember what your other question was.
I asked you about research funding.
Oh yeah, research funding. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think traditionally law professors haven't thought about grant funding very much. And so we have successfully gotten some good grant funding, and that's been a really nice piece of the puzzle. And I think especially the empirical research lends itself to grant funding. Our clinical programs have been able to attract some grant funding. And so there are aspects of our program, I think, that are more likely to qualify for the sort of grant funding that's available.
Yeah, thank you. Before I turn it over to Kellye, Dean Holley-Walker, I want to ask you a final question for me. There was an article in last week's Chronicle of Higher Ed where 8 deans talked about things that they wish they had known before they became a dean.
Yes.
At least regarding the financial landscape of legal ed, are there things that you wish you had known, or put another way, are there things that you would counsel incoming deans that they ought to know about the finances of legal education?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest changes for me is I spent most of my time teaching at a public law school, and obviously in the private law school world, the budget information is held a lot closer to the vest than at other places. So I asked a lot of questions as I was interviewing for this job to kind of see where we were in terms of the budget. I think one of the interesting things to me was this idea of whether you're changing budget models as a university. So many universities now are changing budget models, or they've recently changed budget models, from a centralized budget model to a more responsibility-centered budget model, or the opposite way. And I think knowing whether you're likely to be facing some of those changes is one of the things that I think is important to ask. Here at Howard, we are very much on a centralized budget model in which the provost really controls a lot of the budget. The provost and CFO control the budget essentially for the schools and colleges without, for example, your tuition dollars having a direct impact on that. So for example, things like our LLM program, I wanted to grow the LLM program to help bring in more resources for the law school, but I quickly realized, okay, those are going into the central pot anyway, and we may not see very much advantage from growing it, and it was a lot of pressure in many ways, I think, on faculty and staff and other resources. So while we've looked to grow that program, I think you need to know where those potential resources are. I think the other thing to ask about that a lot of us maybe don't ask about is those questions about what else is there out there in terms of pools of money in the university? So yes, you have your tuition money to depend on if that comes back to you in a big way in the budget model. You can also have what you fundraise, et cetera, but then is there other money out there? So basically, as part of your employment contract, can you get concessions from the university? I did related to money for summer research for faculty, related to support for academic support and bar prep. And some of those you can tie to your own employment contract as things that you need to make happen to make the institution successful. And that's something that someone else on the market told me that some of those can come as directly connected to your deanship. And the best time, obviously, to negotiate that is when you first enter, is the best time to do do it. And then if you're re-upping a contract, to be able to try to negotiate some of that again. And I think the difference in terms of negotiating for yourself, your own salary, your own benefits, those things, versus negotiating things for the law school, I think that's a key part of being successful as a new dean, is to figure out the resources you need. Are they there? And if they aren't there, to get the university to make some concessions right up front about what those resources will be.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. There are, real distinctions between the public institutions and privates. And then even in a given campus, administrations change, and navigating the waters can change with the change of administrations. Great. Kellye?
Thanks, Ken. And I want to thank all the deans for being with us today. As you know, after being a dean for a number of years, I'm leading the Law School Admission Council, where we're urging schools and candidates to really think hard about the future of justice and how we can work together to build that. In our world, as Dean Johnson noted, we have a lot of demand for more justice today. So I want to turn the conversation a bit toward the candidates and in thinking about how you can offer advice as the students are considering law school or even in law school for navigating the finances of legal education. And one of the things that I'd like to hear each of you offer a brief comment on is just, what's the nature of your legal education's focus today? And is it that it's more expensive to do? One of the things that students have sought very much is more hands-on legal education, more clinical classes, for instance. And can each of you maybe offer a few comments about how the nature of education today is impacting the financing of legal education? Let me start with you, Dean Anderson. And in doing that, I want to thank you for all the work you've been doing and raising this issue of cost among the deans and keeping that conversation flowing so we can all stay focused on it.
Yes, thank you. It's certainly the experiential part can be expensive, and our clinical programs have been around for a long time, and that's something that we're very proud of and think is, we've always thought that was an essential part of education. So that hasn't really changed for us, thankfully, in terms of the equation. And also the ability to have, adjuncts that are top quality people in their field to sort of round out your program is a great thing to have access to. So we've been very lucky in both of those things in terms of the expense of the education that we're delivering.
Very good. Dean Lidsky, how about from your perspective and the nature of education, how that's impacting cost?
Well, so I do think that clinical education is more expensive than classroom education. I know for much of my career, I would teach 110 students in torts, whereas the proper ratio in a clinic is 1:8 to get the proper supervision. And one of the things that I think is really an enhancement or an improvement is practicum courses. Sometimes they can be as good or better than live client clinic courses because the simulations can be tailor-made to provide rich learning experiences, particularly where you have really experience. We have a deal skills class that I think is just, every student who's ever gone through it has said it was one of the best classes they ever had, and it's more of a practicum course than a live client clinic. So I think students need to think in terms of that and think in terms of externships as well. But one thing I wish more students would really look at, or that I think is one of the smartest things to look at coming in, is understanding how you get scholarships to law school and understanding how to target what your GPA and LSAT are to getting the maximal scholarships, and also practicing where you want to practice. I feel like if you graduate with $150,000 in debt from law school, it's like you have shackles on. I was very fortunate to be able to have my dream job at 25 because I had a full scholarship to law school, and it made all the difference in the world to me taking my dream job. I had a job offer on the table to make twice as much, but I was able to take the job I really wanted because I didn't come out of law school with debt. And so I think really students need to think seriously about that. I think students today do think more about that, but they need to understand that there's there's a way to predict whether you'll get scholarships or not based on the equation between your GPA and your LSAT. Look at the medians of the school from the past year and where you fall relative to those medians, and that's going to tell you whether you are likely to get a scholarship to that school.
Thank you so much. And I know I'm with you today from Villanova School of Law, where I'm teaching a gender and law class, and I was talking with some of my students, and they were making the comment that they know so many students at other schools, and how even though each law school is unique in some ways, that they often feel very lucky that the quality of legal education across the United States is really so strong. And that's something that I've certainly seen too, that there's so much good teaching, and the clinics and the classrooms, and in so many of our law schools. Dean Johnson, I have admired so much what you've been doing at UC Davis. Could you share some comments on the nature of education and how that's impacting any of the cost issues that you see?
I think we're seeing a real generational shift in legal education and improvements in legal education, but also some cost pressures in those improvements. I went to law school a long time ago, so there was no thought that there'd be academic support or an academic support system for law students. The academic support system was provided was basically sink or swim, and if you couldn't swim, then you were going to be left out. And I think it's good to have academic support. I think it's good to have we have a counselor who works with students on stress management and healthy responses to stress and things like that. When I was in law school, there's nothing like that. We have bar support programs that I think are good for students, and we want students to pass the bar, and we should do that. But when I went to law school, there's no bar support programs. If you didn't pass the bar, that was on you. When I went to law school, there were no clinical programs. There's basically none at all. There are great additions to legal education, but they are more costly. Teaching one person teaching 8 students costs a lot more than one person teaching 500 students in a large lecture class. Externship programs and the kind of monitoring of externship programs that both the ABA requires and is good for the students and for the programs, that costs money as well. And so I think all of these things, and it's year by year, there are a lot of changes that tend to increase costs, and it requires us to be very nimble and on top of things to try to contain costs, cut where we can. But there are often pressures to provide more and more and more, and it's been one of the real challenges I found as dean, because you don't want. We've had a fee sort of freeze for 7 years, so that their fees aren't going up, but tell you a counselor with benefits costs you a couple $100,000, and that's a lot. That's a lot of my budget. A bar support program with 3 or 4 professionals. That's money too. So I'd say that I think legal education has improved a lot. Cost pressures have grown as well, and it's required me and our team to be as lean and mean as we can be in that regard. And I now that we have a counselor here, now the students want another counselor, and that's good. It's good. Actually, overall it's a good thing. But the pressures to spend more. And I don't want to criticize students. I understand that tuition costs in our system are very high. At the same time, it's students want to pay less and less, and I'd like them to pay less and less, but they want more and more. And it's hard to balance those two things. And it's created incredible pressures, I think, on deans, and I've certainly felt them. I also understand how you increase fees. You decrease demand for applicants, and you often will decrease the diversity of your student body as well as your applicant pool. And I take that very seriously. I take all these things very seriously, but I don't think they're easy to balance. And I don't think sometimes people who complain about the fees that are charged by law schools understand some of the sort of the increased cost pressures on law schools.
Thank you, Dean Johnson. I appreciate that. And in many ways, I think that so much of the world, including university leadership, got used to the big classroom model of legal ed. And as it really shifted into a more hands-on model, which delivered a lot more value to our students, we needed to all make that adjustment, thinking about it a little more like engineering or medicine or some of the applied areas. So I appreciate your comments about that. Dean Holley-Walker, I want to turn to you. We so much admire your leadership and your institution's commitment to access and equity, and I want to ask you for some reflections on how the kind of education you're delivering is navigating some of the pressures that Dean Johnson noted.
I think one of the just additional things that we consider is when you are offering legal education primarily to a group that you know has very few resources, not just themselves, but also their families. So at Howard in general, but especially at the law school, most of the students who come to us, of course, are mostly students of African descent and other students of color. Many of them come from families where they have very little wealth and small incomes and not a lot of resources there. So I think one of the things that we've done to combat that is to have our tuition is about half what the typical private school tuition is for law students, because we know that our students and their families just simply can't afford what is the going rate now at most private law schools. And it is interesting because the mission of our school, though, requires that they get incredibly hands-on training, right? So our mission is to train the next generation of leaders and communities that will make changes, positive changes for marginalized communities here in the United States and throughout the world. And so that really requires, Howard is one of the homes of clinical education. So we've had a lot of clinical education for a long time. And it's not just, related to the ABA requirements, but it's core to our mission. And so we, for that reason, have also chosen to stay very small. So our biggest size is about 155 or so. So all of that means that our resources by design are smaller, but we have to provide a lot of individualized and smaller classes to students in order to be able to allow them to get the kind of training that allows them to hit the ground running when they are lawyers in poor communities, which is what we're training many of them to go out and do. And so that is, I think, an additional pressure on the resource side. But then, of course, adding clinics. But I think one of the things we've been able to do is find more and more grant funding for our clinics and to really look specifically for grant funding for our clinics. And so right now we have two of our major clinics, our criminal justice clinic and our child welfare clinic, are both funded entirely through grant funding. And so that's been one of the avenues that we've tried to pursue to take off a little bit of that pressure, try to make it something that's actually an advantage, the fact that this is core to our law school mission to help to attract more grants to the law school to help fulfill that mission.
That's terrific to hear, and it's amazing to me to count up all the hours that law school clinics devote to public interest law. The Association of American Law School always tabulates that every year, and it's just remarkable how law schools have stepped in to fill the gap of access to justice during cutbacks and continued cutbacks in funding. So I want to thank you and all the deans for all that they do in that regard. If we could turn the conversation even more directly now to candidates, people thinking about attending law school. And I know that we at LSAC were pleased to see admissions really increasing, the number of people applying to law school going up. But at the same time, I think there was a real realization on the part of schools to calibrate that to the employment market. And so even though the number of students applying went up significantly, the number that schools admitted and enrolled didn't match that. It was more finely tuned to the employment market. So I'd like to start with Dean Lidsky and hear a little bit about, what's your advice to candidates right now, as they're thinking about the opportunity of legal education? How should they be calculating and thinking about that balance between the investment and the return in terms of the job market?
Well, first off, I think you have to know yourself and what it is you really want to do. And sometimes that's hard. If you'd asked me when I went to law school, I would have said I wanted to be a corporate lawyer. And in fact, nothing is further from the truth. It just sounded good. I, didn't know any lawyers. So you need to start by talking to lawyers in the field and perhaps getting some work experience and trying to see the breadth of legal practice. And really law schools, I think almost all of us are trying to expose students early on to practicing lawyers so they have a sense of what it is they might want to do. But it really depends what you want to do, where you need to go to law school. If you want to be a leader in your state, oftentimes it's very beneficial to go to the top public law school in the state. If if on the other hand, if you want to be a legal academic, perhaps you need to make a different choice. So really talking to as many people as you can and talking to them about the vibrancy of the legal market, where the jobs are, what the jobs of the future are, what they look like, I think is an essential part of your research. But if you're not making a cost-benefit analysis, I think you're looking at it the wrong way. Students today seem to me to be much more savvy than they were in the past about that fact. They understand that law jobs plummeted and then they're coming back, but they want to know they're going to have jobs at the end of it. Look at the school's employment rate. That's going to tell you a lot. So look at the employment rate, look at the debt burden, and make an informed choice about where you want to practice, and that will help guide you to the right school. Don't just pick, the most expensive school you get into, because that can be a bad choice for you. Particularly if you want to do public interest law in your home state, that would be a very bad choice, most likely.
Thank you so much. Dean Johnson, I want to ask this question to you in terms of, and put it this way, one of the most common phrases typed into our website is law school worth it? And so I wonder, what are your reflections for candidates today making that calculation?
Depends on who you are, if law school is worth it. It's very important to do that self-introspection that Dean Lidsky mentioned, and to not go to law school for reasons that many people did in the olden days when I went to law school, because I was a poli-sci major and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I think that today, if you should think about law, think about the part of law that you might be interested in, yourself, think about what you're passionate about, and then think about what law school best fits what you want to do in terms of your career, your path, and what your passions are. I do think it's also very important for students to think about the community of a law school and how they would respond to that community. Not every law school is for everybody, but there is a law school for everybody. And I think it's important that students pay attention, talk to students, as well as looking at the fundamentals in terms of the numbers, employment numbers, and things like that. But I do think also that, campus visits are kind of essential, and to get a feel for a place and whether you could see yourself fitting in there, both locally in the law school, but also locally in the region. So I do think that it requires an awful lot of work and thought. The cost of going to a place is something to consider. The employment numbers for graduates, something to consider. The places where the graduates go to work on graduation is worth considering. And all those variables, they'll cut in different ways for different candidates, depending on where they're interested in working, what they're interested in doing, and things like that. So I do think it's a very individual decision, and one that shouldn't be made by pulling out the U.S. News rankings and just going down the list to see where you got admitted. I do think that it requires a little more intuition and thought in terms about the softer aspects of a school, but the softer aspects of your decision-making process as well. And I think that's harder work, and maybe that's why some people don't do it. But I think it's important work.
Thank you so much. And Dean Anderson, I know that several of you have mentioned the topic of public interest law particularly, and I'd like to ask for your reflections on how students that know that that's what they're aiming for in terms of going to law school. One of the things our research shows right now is by far the most common reason for pursuing a law degree is the desire to make the world better, to change it, and to really work for more social justice. And so if that's the student's aim, how should he or she be thinking about the opportunities of legal education?
I think that's great that students have that motivation. I think that's wonderful. And in fact, I just talked to some prospective students about that yesterday, about that motivation. I think one thing they can recognize too is that it's not just public interest lawyers per se that do public interest law. There are a lot of people that work in all kinds of private practice that can engage in public interest work as a part of their practice and still do, auto accidents and divorces to pay the light bill. And so I think, if you think about broadly defining the idea of helping society to get better, I think almost every lawyer is engaged in that in some way or another. And so I think it's a wonderful motivation for people that want to go to law school. And I just want to follow up too on what Dean Johnson said. And also what Dean Lidsky said about the sort of value proposition of law school. You should also think about it in terms of not only how much you're going to make that first year, that first couple of years, but think about where you're going to be 10 years from now. Think about where you're going to be 20 years from now, and look at what the people are making in that way. Because you might find that it becomes a really good investment that you've made, but it's going to take a while. And so that relates particularly to rural practice, where if you go to a small town, it might take you a while to start making any money. And you might actually, not make a whole lot of money your first couple of years. But the rural attorneys that I have talked to, after 10 years, they're making a really good living. And it's a great quality of life. And it's a great place to raise your family and all that sort of thing. So I just think you need to look a little bit longer term when you're thinking about the value proposition of law school in general. And we just started now a rural attorney practice program that helps people over that hump, because I think in a lot of states that our law schools are located in, there's a big problem with smaller towns not having enough lawyers. And so you might find that the jobs for lawyers are not as robust in some of the big cities, but there are small towns in the United States that would love to see you. If you can go to a small town and get a practice started up, they would love to have you, and there's plenty of work available there. So our program is like many others, I think, trying to get students to think about that as a career and help them get started and get them over the hump in terms of going out to a small town and starting up a practice.
That's great to be reminded of that rural need. And I hear a lot too, just with the demographics of the baby boom generation, that there are a lot of retiring lawyers who are having trouble finding new lawyers that want to work with them and then transition their practice. So a lot of opportunity there to get mentoring and not even have to start from scratch. Dean Holley-Walker, I want to turn to you to reflect on public interest or really just the wide range of careers that law-trained individuals might pursue.
Yeah, I love what Dean Anderson and Dean Lidsky just said about really understanding why you want to go to law school. I think in thinking of the value proposition in the long term, and I think especially for public interest lawyers, I think one of the most curious things that happens is many law students say on their applications, like you were saying with before the JD study, we learn, that the reason people want to come to law school is they want to make a difference in the world. Then when they get into the environment of law school, many times all of a sudden they change their mind, or we start to, even if it subtly steered them in other directions that might make it a little bit easier for them to pay off their loans, et cetera. So I think one of the things I love the idea of the program that Missouri is doing about really doing a lot of financial counseling with students. And I think if you are going to be a public interest lawyer, we have to be realistic with students on the front end about you need to take on as little debt as possible. Let's help you plan for what kinds of fellowships you may be able to get afterwards, what kind of loan forgiveness programs are really out there. I think we are now understanding as a community that it is not good enough just to say we want social justice engineers, which is what we always say here at Howard, but how on the ground do people live when they're doing public interest work and not making very much money? And I think that now requires a lot more financial counseling from the outset of law school, making sure that students are aware of all the options that they have once they graduate, and also encouraging policy, like we've seen all of us who've been really encouraging the public interest loan forgiveness programs to continue, because those are really key to helping students realistically choose those options and be able to live a really good life as they do it, right? So we don't want to graduate people who think, okay, I'm doing my mission in terms of my work, but I'm not able to support my family or pay my loans or all of those practical concerns that people have from their profession. So I think it just takes a lot more planning than we've done in the past if we realistically want students to be able to meet that gap in terms of access to justice.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I want to give you each a chance to make a minute or so comment about anything that we've talked about today, or anything we haven't touched on, because this topic is so broad. As I do that, I want to encourage all the law students and the candidates to know that your investment in becoming more financially savvy is not just going to help you, it's going to help your clients. That's something that all lawyers need to be able to do. And one of our allied organizations in legal education, the Access Lex Institute, has a great financial literacy program that they've helped law schools develop. And that's a great tool for just understanding and learning about this area so that you can make the best decisions and also grow your own skills for advising clients as you get out. So let me begin with Dean Johnson and kind of go around each of the four of you and ask for any closing remarks you'd like to make on this topic of financing legal education.
Well, I'd like to actually say something to the candidates who are thinking about law schools. I really think that it's a mistake to rely exclusively and only on the U.S. News rankings. U.S. News rankings have many failings, and I don't have enough time to describe them all to you because I only have about 30 seconds left. But it doesn't measure things like effective teaching or strength of teachers, diversity of the faculty, diversity of the student body, the community at the law school, and things that I think are very important to an effective legal education. So I do think that it's very important to make informed judgments and include in those informed judgments things beyond the rankings, and to think carefully about whether you want to invest in a career in the law. I think it's a great career with many options, but it is an investment of time and resources and money. And I think it's a good decision to make before going to law school as opposed to after and finding in law school that you're not happy. I think that informed judgments are better than ones that are not fully formed. And so I encourage people thinking about law school to really give it a go.
Thank you so much. Dean Lidsky, let me turn to you for your closing comment.
So as a professor, I always thought it was my job to help people find what they were meant to do in life. And that's my mission as a dean. I want every student to find the career they were meant to have and find what they were meant to do. And part of that is when that dream job comes along, being able to afford to take the dream job, even if it doesn't pay as much as the other job you have in hand. So I think students need to empower themselves by getting financial literacy at the outset. Statistics show that there's, with undergraduates, that the level of financial literacy needs to be higher. So it's a form of self-empowerment. The other thing we haven't talked about that I just wanted to mention is when you're looking at a school, look at the strength of the alumni network. That is something, those connections go with you for life. So look at how passionate the alums who are 2 years out, 1 year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, 30 years out, how do they feel about their law school experience, and how committed are they to bringing new people into their network? And I think that's something that it's a little bit intangible, but you can really get it by going to events at the school and talking to alumni of the school about how they feel. And that's something I think that you should consider, because that's part of how you get the job that you want at the end of the day.
That's great advice. And it's not even just your first job, but even the next one with that alumni network. Thank you so much. Dean Anderson, let me turn it to you.
Right. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep it really short. But we're asking students to think about where they want to be in the future, and I think a lot of students are thinking, I'm not sure where I'm going to be 10 years from now. And one of the great things about a law degree is that, as deans, we all go out and see our alumni doing such an incredible variety of things. They could be using their law degrees in business, for example, or they could be using it in politics. The president of my university is a lawyer, and he's a great university president because he approaches those issues like a lawyer does, which means that he approaches those problems with critical thinking skills that he learned in law school. And so I think that no matter what profession these graduates go into, they would all look at their law degrees as being a valuable part of that career. So I guess my point is that we're asking students to predict the future. Where are you going to be 20 years from now? And you may not know. But typically, investing in a law degree is going to be a good choice for you to make. It's just that the question is, do you want to spend for this Mercedes automobile when, in fact, the Ford automobile may be exactly what you need for your particular needs? And so just think about the fact of what you're investing in and make sure that you're not overspending in a way that doesn't make sense and is going to get you in trouble.
Thank you. Dean Holley-Walker, it's an honor to give you the last word on the closing statement.
I think just following in that theme, I'd really encourage any candidate for law school to apply to a range of law schools, right? Apply to your flagship public school, apply to, a private school that may, be the most expensive, but you may be eligible for scholarships for many of the reasons that Dean Lidsky talked about earlier. Apply to, something that is a little bit more reasonable in cost. Apply to a big law school with a big enrollment, small law schools. I think what that does is it gives you on the other end, once you find out where you got in, you can look at your scholarships, et cetera, and really ask the hard questions about career placement numbers and what you want to do. But I think sometimes candidates limit their choices. And so when they do get into all of their dream schools, they find out, okay, these schools are very similar in a lot of ways. And now I don't have a choice maybe to make that decision of a Ford versus Mercedes. If you applied only, to buy 10 Mercedes, you don't have that choice at the end. And so I really encourage students to, take a broad look when they first apply. Don't be afraid to apply to more law schools than you think you need to, but make it a range so that you can make a great decision on the other side.
Thank you, Dean Holley-Walker. And I want to, on behalf of myself and the Law School Admission Council and my co-host, Dean Ken Randall from iLaw, thank all the deans for their great comments today. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that our candidates and the other members of the legal community have too. So thank you for your service to legal ed deans, and thank you for being with us today. I also want to let our listeners know that our next broadcast will be March 4th, same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard, and the topic will be March Madness. We have heard many things today about U.S. news, and we're going to take that on directly. So please tune in March on the 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard for March Madness with Kellye and Ken. Thank you all, and have a good evening.